Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the festival director. Over the coming months, we look forward to sharing with you the audio recordings from the 2022 festival. FODI started in 2009 and is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival. FODI exists to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. Our obsession with true crime is everywhere, from news stories and podcasts to the big screen. However, in recent decades, rates of almost all crimes around the world have declined dramatically. Meanwhile, the number of people in prison has increased alarmingly. TV and film critic Wenlei Ma, journalist Kate McClymont, and former executive director of the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics Don Weatherburn investigate why the data and crime and our obsession with these stories don't add up. Please enjoy this FODI 2022 panel discussion chaired by FODI co-curator Anne Mossop, The Crime Paradox.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this discussion about the crime paradox. I'm Anne Mossop. I'm the Artistic Director of Sydney Writers' Festival and one of the curators of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. And I'm delighted to see you all here this afternoon and to welcome our distinguished panel. We're here to have a conversation about the intersection between real crime and all of the different varieties of stories about crime that we make as a culture, from so-called true crime to crime fiction to noir, film and television. And the crime paradox that we're talking about is the fact that the less crime there is in real life, the more people we send to prison and the more we want to talk about crime and read about it. I'm going to introduce our speakers in a minute. I feel like that we have so much to talk about this afternoon. We're going to touch on, we're not going to be able to cover everything by any stretch of the imagination. We're going to have some time at the end for questions from you, so store them up, and there are some microphones in the audience that shortly before the end of the session I'll invite you to come up if you do have a question. Before we really get going though, I want to ask you, with a show of hands, to tell me what you know about the situation with crime in Australia. And now, you're all here, you've come along, you've bought a ticket to something called the Crime Paradox, you probably read the nice little blurb. So you're au fait with the fact that, in fact, crime rates in Australia are not rising. But I just want to see what you think about how crime rates are falling. And so if we think about the most serious crime of homicide, there are some statistics in Don's book, The Vanishing Criminal, about the drop in crime in the 30 years between 1988 and 2018. And I'm going to give you three figures for that drop, and I want you to let me know by show of hands which one you think is true. So do we think that crime has dropped 24%, 52%, or 67% in those 30 years between 1988 and 2018? So who thinks it's dropped by 24%? Okay, by 52%. And by 67%. Okay, so that was a vote for 52, with more for 67, fewer for 25. Excellent. We're going to share with you what the real answer to that is shortly. It is in fact, okay, we'll...
Be terrible if they were right.
It's 67. So I'm afraid you didn't get it right, but you were not too bad. It could have been worse. You could have said 24 or, I should have offered you the option of stable. But yes, so the crime of homicide has dropped by 67% in a way that is incredibly interesting and something that we'll be talking about. So we have three speakers here who are experts in their fields and who can each talk about different parts of this puzzle. Don Weatherburn, for many years the Director of Crime Statistics and Research in New South Wales, the person that you would hear on the radio telling you what was happening with crime. He's now a professor at UNSW Sydney and the author of a wonderful book called The Vanishing Criminal. So those of you who are infatuated with the crime drop part of this conversation might want to take that up. Wenlei Ma writes about film and television for news.com.au. She's a top-rated critic on Rotten Tomatoes, and she's somebody who is going to guide us through the incredible story about the blossoming of crime in the world of film and television. Legendary investigative reporter Kate McClymont from the Sydney Morning Herald somebody who has been telling us about what's going wrong in Sydney and in New South Wales for many years, author of He Who Must Be Obeyed, and Dead Man Walking, The Murky World of Michael McGurk and Ron Medich. So to open up the conversation, just as a warm-up, I want to ask each of you what you're reading or watching at the moment in the crime fiction TV film space. What have you enjoyed or been fascinated by?
Well, I'm watching The Wall, and it's not my favourite show. The Killing and The Bridge and Montalbano. Anybody watch Montalbano? No,
An oldie but a goodie,
Lost is a good
SBS
one.
people.
But The Wall's not bad. It's set in Quebec, and the lead character has had a fling already with the main detective there, but his attention's now shifted to shall I go on? But the real problem is that the lead detective keeps speculating about the mind of the murderer, and it's just not working for her. I think she should just get on with investigating.
Good to know. Wenlei?
Probably like many people in this room, I'm watching Only Murders in the Building. I love a cozy detective fiction, and I love it when it's meta, when it's people thinking they can solve their own crime because they're ordinary citizens like you and I. I think maybe a lot of people who did have to make podcasts, maybe there's a few people in here during the pandemic, knows all about getting under a blanket to try and muffle the audio, and watching sort of Steve Martin, Martin Short and Selena Gomez do it in a closet is triggering but also resonant. And I also really enjoyed this series called The After Party, which was on Apple TV, and it was about a school reunion, and the very famous person among them is killed, and then you've got this very limited pool of suspects. Who did it? It's very Agatha Christie-esque.
Kate?
I'm also watching the second series of Only Murders in the Building, which I love. And I've gone back to watch Broadchurch again, which I really loved. And I think when you get to a certain age, you find that you really can't quite remember what happened. So, yeah, that's great. You can watch it all over again. I love it. So I'm doing that. And I'm up to series 3 of Better Call Saul. And I never watched it at the time. I loved Breaking Bad. So that's been really good as well. But I was very disappointed that Bob Odenkirk missed out on an Emmy. Was this the 39th time Better Call Saul's been nominated for 0?
The 46th time.
Sorry, underestimated.
They have one more year of eligibility, so possibly one Emmy to come.
So we're going to start by talking to Don a little bit about that drop in crime rates and the increase in incarceration. And tell us the story of what has happened with crime since the 1980s and 1990s in Australia, and a little bit about the context in the world in which it's happening. Because it's a really extraordinary story.
Well, I think, is anybody here as old as I am? Go on, admit it. Anybody who's lived through the 80s anyway will remember it was a time of rampant crime. We had armed robberies galore. We had people walking into banks so often with helmets, motorcycle helmets, to rob the bank that they at one stage banned wearing motorcycle helmets in banks. When it became harder to rob a bank, some of you may remember this all started when the screen shot up and the robber got caught between the ceiling and the shutter and died there. After that, there was a big drop in bank robberies. So they switched to 7-Eleven stores and service stations, but there were kids running around with syringes threatening people with the possibility of AIDS while they were robbing 7-Eleven stores. So the 80s were a terrible time. And to make matters worse, police were doing as much crime as all the other criminals. They were involved, deeply involved, as it later turned out, thanks to Kate, deeply involved in the drug trade and prostitution and other forms of vice. That continued to such an extent that everybody thought it was normal. And then suddenly around about 2000, Christmas 2000, the heroin shortage hit. The price of heroin went up dramatically, the purity of heroin dropped dramatically, and straight after that we started to get big drops in motor vehicle theft, in robbery, in burglary, in all the general theft categories. They started to fall. So that by 2017-18 we had a situation where robbery, breaking into motor vehicle theft had dropped by 80%, where homicide, as you've pointed out, had dropped by depending on your start point, between 40 and 60%. The only crimes left rising around that point, around about 2008, were assault, sexual assault, fraud, and drugs. Then around about 2008, we started to get a drop in assault. young kids stopped drinking as much alcohol and switched to ecstasy. Well, I don't actually know that, but I'm guessing that.
He's probably
I
theorising
thought
with a bit
someone
more
would challenge
information
me
than
on
most
that.
of us.
Anyway, they stopped drinking, I know that for sure. And the assault rate started dropping as well, which left us, or leaves us now, with really three big problems. One of them is a growth in methamphetamine use, which has gone up dramatically. One of them is a growth in fraud, which is mainly related to the internet. One of them is related to so-called acts intended to cause injury, but in fact the primary driver there is stalking. The police have discovered that they can get onto the web and find people threatening one another over the internet, and they can charge them with stalking, and most of them will go to jail because the threats are quite genuine. And that's basically where it stands at the moment. Homicide is still falling, break-and-enter is still falling, robbery is still falling. It's got to level out at some point. We can't have a world where there's no robbery or no assault. I'll be completely out of work. But that's a short story. Do you want me to go on?
Well, I think it's really interesting to talk about potentially two of those exceptions to this decline, one of which is sexual assault and the other of which is the fraud scam side of things. Can you tell us a little bit about what we know about what the situation with sexual assault?
Sure. Well, in terms of what's driving, the recorded rate is going up. The primary driver of the increase at the moment is two things. First of all, a growth in the number of people arrested for child pornography, and the second one is a growth, especially after the Royal Commission, in the number of people picked up for child sexual assault. If you take those two categories out, it's not at all clear that sexual assault is rising, but there's certainly been a growth in those two subcategories.
And also, obviously, what we know about sexual assault is that the kind of statistical information that we're relying on here, which is people reporting it to the police and things being, treated in the law, is potentially only a fraction of the sexual assault that's occurring. So the whole issue about reporting is also potentially...
That's right. I mean, even when the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, does its annual survey, you only get, around about 2% reporting it, but you know that the vast majority of victims of sexual assault are not reporting it to the police. And so the capacity for that to increase, especially when I think women are becoming more confident about reporting those sorts of offences and domestic violence, there's bound to be a growth in the police figures associated with those. Whether there's been a real growth in the incidents is another matter, and it's pretty hard to say.
But before we move on, the really interesting thing about all of this is what we know and don't know about why. Now, there are some really fascinating things when you start looking at, reading the kind of thing that Don's written about this, the whole thing about the opportunity to commit crime, things that prevent it. There are some really interesting things like the fact that, motor vehicle theft is prevented by the technology that immobilises car engines. But perhaps the most interesting unresolved one of these is the question about why the homicide rate has dropped. What do we know about that and what don't we know about that?
I don't know why the homicide rate's dropped. I'll be straight out about that. I mean, I think it's a real puzzle, and I haven't seen anyone come up with a credible explanation for it. I know there's a lot of talk about the gun buyback contributing to it, and perhaps it did, but homicide was coming down well before the gun buyback occurred. If you split homicide into its various subcategories, you don't find one particular subcategory dropping faster than the rest of them. One possible explanation I put forward in the book, and I'm not sure it's true, but it's an intriguing one, is that people are being attacked as often as they have been previously, but they're less likely to die because the emergency medical procedures are much better now at saving people. So what was once, or what would have been once, a homicide turns into a very serious assault. I mean, that's speculation. It's plausible speculation, but no one's done the work yet to actually confirm whether that's the case.
Before we move into a broader conversation about this, there's one other piece of information that I think it's really useful for us to understand as a basis for this conversation. So we're in a situation where we can see all of these things. In fact, perhaps two other pieces of information. One of which is the fact that this is what's happening in Australia, but this is a pattern, broadly speaking, at different levels. For example, Japan, country with lower crime, United States, country with higher crime. But broadly speaking, this is a pattern that's common throughout the world.
Yeah, there are those of us who fuss about detail can see
Sorry.
some details. No, there has been a reduction. The United States and the UK got their reduction in crime much earlier than did Australia by about 10 years. And there have been some differences in what's fallen. For example, assault fell in the United States in the early 1990s. It didn't start falling in Australia until 2008. And that makes it rather difficult to argue that it's all exactly the same factors that are operating here.
And the other question, of course, is about the trends in the rates of incarceration. So we've got all crime dropping. What happens to our rates of incarceration over a similar period?
Well, they've skyrocketed, particularly since 2010. They sort of bumped up a little bit between 2001 and 2009. Then in 2010, they really started going up dramatically. And there were several things that contributed to that. One was an enormous growth in the number of people turning up in court for so-called acts intended to cause injury. And big drivers there were sexual assault, including child sexual assault, domestic assault. There was also an increase in the proportion of those convicted who went to jail. The other big increase was the methamphetamine people picked up for dealing and trafficking in amphetamine. That skyrocketed. And there have also been, there was one other category I can't remember. This is the ageing process. Does anybody out there know what the other one is? Parking fines. No, I don't think. Wasn't parking fines. I mean, they're getting trigger happy out there on the bench.
You can see what kind of criminal we have in the audience here.
Well, look, people talk about remand, and it's certainly true that remand has gone up, but remand will always go up when the number of people going to jail, sentence prison goes up. Because if they think they're going to send them to jail, they'll remand them in custody first. But, the Bail Act has made some contribution to that. I don't think it's been the primary reason for the increase, but others may differ, and I'm sure they'll tell me shortly after this session ends. Maybe.
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah, of course.
One thing that fascinates me about the incarceration rate is that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait population is 3.3% of our population, and yet that group represents 30% of all people in our prisons, which every time I think about it, just absolutely stuns me.
Or 50% for the kids.
50% for the kids.
It is stunning and depressing to do with it. But, one of the things that's exacerbated the rate of Aboriginal imprisonment has been the police focus on repeat offenders. So the police decided with the Suspect Target Management Plan, anybody familiar? Read that report? Basically, the police adopted a plan of, instead of having an armed robbery squad and a break and enter squad and a motor vehicle theft squad, they started drawing up lists in every local area command of the people they thought were prolific offenders, and then they went after them for anything they could get them for. I know I'm going to be accused of making it a bit simple, but basically the idea was to find repeat offenders on the argument that if you take repeat offenders out of the system, you'll get a disproportionate drop in crime. Well, you know who's got the longest criminal records? It's Aboriginal kids and Aboriginal adults. So they were ended up being disproportionately the focus of this Suspect Target Management Plan, and that accelerated the rate of growth of Aboriginal people in prison. But it's not the only factor. They were applying this across the board. So basically...
But also, I think that the more money you have, the better quality of justice you can buy.
Sure.
And, I've just seen that time and time again with wealthy criminals who can, hire a whole team of lawyers, challenge everything. And also they have, in the court system, they're given a presumption of, a better class of person. Whereas I think a lot of, low socioeconomic classes, one, don't have access to good legal representation, and two, they're just automatically put away, whereas other people are not.
Well, that's why we've got you, Kate, to bring the big end down.
We don't look at those. We don't look at those kind of things. But I can remember somebody who had been to jail several times saying to me, "Yes, the quality of justice is what you get when your money runs out." And I thought, right, okay, yep, fair enough. So, when you finally get to jail, that's what happens to you.
Well, and the problem starts quite young. I've just done a study with Brendan Thomas, which I shouldn't talk about because it hasn't gone through peer review yet, but suffice to say it's pretty clear right at the get-go. So where police are making a choice between caution and prosecution, that Aboriginal people are more likely to be prosecuted, Aboriginal kids are more likely to be prosecuted. And of course, once you've got a criminal conviction, the chances of next time round or the next or third time round of getting a custodial sentence go up. And once you've got a custodial sentence, the chance of avoiding a custodial sentence goes down the next time you're before the court. So it's a process of accumulating disadvantage from the very beginning.
Well, there was a case recently where a Sydney grammar boy a former Sydney grammar boy was caught with, quite a lot of, I think it was methamphetamine, and he'd previously had a conviction for drug possession of a commercial quantity. He'd got a good behaviour first time round because he came from a well-to-do family and got a smaller custodial sentence the second time round. And I just thought, what if he'd been from Coonabarabran? What would have happened there?
Well, it's not hard to guess what would have happened.
It's not.
But the irony...
No, go ahead.
The irony about this, of course, is that some lawyer will correct me, but in a sense what the court is doing is re-punishing you for your past offending when you've already been punished for your past offending. Theoretically, what's supposed to happen as you accumulate a criminal record is that you lose mitigation. In other words, you don't get the benefit of having a clean sheet. But if you look at the sentences, it's the difference between, say, someone getting a 12-year sentence and someone getting a bond. Well, you can't say that's just loss of mitigation. It's clear that every time you offend, they're whacking you again, and the consequence is a growth in the rate of entry into prison.
And just the background to that discussion of the rate of incarceration is that it's doubled over that period. And what is interesting about the question about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rates of incarceration is it's extraordinarily different by state. 10 times as many people incarcerated in the Northern Territory per head of population as in the virtually crime-free Australian Capital Territory and Victoria. So it's really marked how those incredible differences. Let's talk about crime and how we read about it and write about it in the news. And Kate, I just want to ask you, what have you seen? Provided that we've got this context that we're sitting in where crime is dropping, it does not seem to be dropping from the front pages of our papers or from our websites.
Look, the media still has a general policy of if it bleeds, it leads. Like it always has been and always will be. And you might think at the moment that we are in the middle of a terrible, gangland warfare between the Alameddines and the Hamzis family. And, that is sort of an aberration. It doesn't reflect what's actually going on. But I don't know who watched Four Corners on Monday night. And also there was an accompanying background briefing that went to air yesterday. And this is one of the things that I found really interesting because they were looking at the change in organised crime and how gangs like, the Alameddines and the Hamzis are recruiting foot soldiers, like poor people growing up in the western suburbs, with not many prospects. Anyway, so this is what they were. So they were asking one of the people, okay, what are the going rates? Okay, for a kidnapping, you're looking at $50,000. If you do a drive-by shooting, that's $20,000 to $25,000. Now, murder, that depends on the celebrity of the person you're killing. A big player, minimum of $250,000. For a lesser player, someone climbing through the ranks, maybe about $100,000. Now, I just think the fact that there are going rates for those kind of things, who would have thought? And
aren't we all glad that we know what they are now, too?
I don't know whether it's that smart telling everybody out there. Some people are leaving by the back door.
No, but it's sort of, when I look at that, it just makes me think of the idiot criminals that I've come across in my time. And particularly, I look at the hitmen who were involved in the murder of Sydney businessman Michael McGurk. I mean, they were such idiots that the two people that did it, One was was the general manager of an accountancy firm at Pymble, and the other was 19 years old. So they get to Cremorne to stake out the murder. They get so bored that one sends the 19-year-old down to the bottle shop, and he doesn't have ID, and he looks too young, so he's not allowed to buy a bottle of Jim Beam. So he goes back and says to the older criminal, "Oh, they won't serve me." So he goes down. So both of the hitmen are in the scene in the bottle shop, and one of the hitmen, the thing that he was most concerned about when he was finally arrested was the extortionate prices that Cremorne charges for their alcohol. That was one thing that completely played on his mind. Anyway, so then they almost prang the getaway car at the first roundabout. They don't have an E-tag, so they're photographed going across the harbour bridge. And then, when they get home, one of them has still got the down payment for the murder in his back pocket, and having watched too many films, they decide they have to burn their clothing, and he forgets the money's in there. So then he burns his hands trying to get, and I just think, no wonder people get caught, they're idiots. But
well, I think you've just given us an object lesson in why in a time of declining crime we still want to read about it, because we're reading about it in this case as comedy.
I'm glad they're idiots, because I do want them to get caught.
Yes.
It's the ones that don't get caught that makes me scared.
Yeah, exactly.
Wenlei, you work in a newsroom, but in the space of talking about culture. What are your observations about the context in which you work, about the fact that we've got this declining crime, but this, the coverage of it is at record levels?
I think, like any business, media is a business, of course. There's always a commercial imperative behind the choices that are made, the decisions that are made by editors. And we all know crime sells or crime clicks. The grislier it is, the gorier it is, the better the headline, the better the image, or better yet, the better the 5 images you can put together in a collage, the more people are going to read it. So the justification for that is always, it's audience-driven, but what we all know is that the audience-driven mentality then goes to, what kind of advertising you're going to be able to sell the next day based on how successful the publication was. And it is audience-driven. There, people out there, readers, viewers, listeners, want to read about crime. And we see time and time and again that the top stories of the day, the top stories of the week are these really often quite sensationalist crimes. They're about bikies, they're about murders, they're about drive-by shootings, they're about the things...
Women with 1 foot.
Women with 1 foot, murders that are 40 years old. They're about the things that we don't encounter in our day-to-day lives. It's a little slice into something a little, extraordinary.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because the crime rate dropped, There's just not enough blood on TV. Everybody's got to start reading and making films about it.
Quite possibly. Kate, before we start talking more about crime, the cultural world of crime, the world of crime, and our stories about crime, I want to get you to talk a little bit about corruption, because this is something that your work has followed over a long period of time, and just to talk about what you think about the kind of crimes, you've mentioned in our discussions that the kind of crimes that affect people most, the kind of crimes that are close to us, which are these, not these sensational, over-dramatic stories, but these things that are going on embedded in the world of government, embedded in the world of money, and which are in fact often quite, when they're uncovered, are often quite procedural, dull stories, but that are incredibly important.
Look, I think it's interesting when you look at how many politicians have actually either been prosecuted or gone to jail for misconduct in public office. And I think the statistics have been boosted greatly by repeat offender Eddie Obeid, who is just doing his 2nd jail term now, and he's also been recently charged, along with Tony Kelly and Joe Tripodi, over misconduct in public office yet again. But the thing that intrigues me is how many times you write about a local mayor or a local councillor and then 8 years, 9 years later, up they pop again. And I think this is where the most pernicious crimes occur. They're not gory and bloody, but they are the ones that affect us the most. As in, there's a beautiful park, near your house, and suddenly it's been sold to a developer. Or, there's no parking anymore. There's no, amenities. It's the things that affect your life the most are the ones that they get away with so readily. And the thing is, it's really easy. In councils, you tend to only, if you're going to bribe somebody, you only need to bribe 2 people, and that's the 2 factional leaders of either party. So if they persuade their other colleagues what to do, and honestly, you only have to, give their Uncle Ted a discounted apartment or a second-hand Honda Civic for the wife or the husband. It's not, but this is a thing. For a small outlay of bribery, you can get another 30 floors. And it's interesting seeing Con Hindi from, one of the southern Shire councils at the moment has been before ICAC. He was getting trips to China and, getting paid with, I think there were some photos anyway of Chinese prostitutes. And you think, that's just not expensive for, like it's cheap for what you are getting. And I remember writing about exactly the same person a couple of years ago, just raising questions about, isn't it funny that Con Hindi's son, who is 18 years old, has just paid $3 million for a property. He's owned it for 3 weeks and he sold it to a developer for twice the amount of money. How does an 18-year-old come up with that kind of money? And when you write these stories, you think, I've got them now. No. And look, I just think that, these are not the sexy stories. Well, I find that they are, especially with the prostitution bits. But, and it's, one of my favourite ones was Rod Medic, who's now in jail for murder. So there was this famous dinner at a restaurant, the Tuscany restaurant in Leichhardt. And earlier that day, Ian McDonald had been on the front page of our paper being branded Sir Lunch-a-Lot for, charging the taxpayers and anyone else for all his lunches. So he gets to lunch at Tuscany and immediately orders a $400 bottle of wine. He's only been called Sir Lunch-a-Lot that day, and here he is at dinner ordering a $400 bottle of wine because he knows the other people are going to pay for it. And it turns out he's having dinner with Lucky Gattalari, Ron Medic, and at a neighbouring table, there is a whole table of prostitutes for Ian McDonald to pick one. And I remember, when it came up at ICAC, there was the woman he chose was a woman called Tiffany, who was a Chinese person. And I remember her giving evidence saying, because Ian McDonald was trying to portray that he was sick and nothing ever happened. And Tiffany said, no, I didn't vomit. He's so ugly, he makes me want to vomit. And I thought, oh, how embarrassing that even the prostitute at the centre of a corruption inquiry really doesn't want to go to bed with you. Poor Ian. But anyway, you just sort of think there's so much repeat offending in this area by the same group of people. And I think if there's any underreporting, it's of corruption.
Yeah.
If we start to think a little bit about how we construct a view of crime in culture, what we talk about, what we read, what we write, what we watch on television, what kind of television is made. One of the things that if you go back to discussions, long before our current era of streaming, digital, everything. If you go back to the kind of discussions about detective fiction from the golden era and onwards, people like P.D. James would talk about the pleasure of detective fiction as somehow a moral universe being created and good triumphing over evil, order being restored, chaos, the crime, and order being restored. What do you think of that? What do you think of that kind of way of constructing what we get out of consuming crime fiction of different sorts?
Well, it doesn't work for No Country, but was it No Country for Old Men?
Yeah.
Which is a fabulous film, but nothing like P.D. James.
No, very different.
So I don't think that, certainly not good enough for me. I much prefer something with a bit more edge to it, like that sort of film, or a book with the same sort of weird side effect to it. But, maybe you'd like P.D.
I don't know, I sort of wonder whether, one, it's that we like solving puzzles, we like mysteries, we like unravelling, and also I think that there is a certain fascination into the lives that we don't lead. And I always like you're trying to work out what makes people tick. Like, what is the psychological factors that have driven these people to do what they do? I always find that really interesting.
Isn't fraud better for that reason? I mean, or the stupidity. I was just thinking while you were talking earlier about how stupid criminals are. The film In Bruges, for example.
Yep.
Brilliant.
Classic
Yep.
example of that. But I think that's right. Resolving a problem is part of it, or leaving a problem unresolved. In the 70s, we had films like Blow Up, which were left unresolved and were better for it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Wenlei?
I mean, I think it also depends on the mood you're in. I mean, there are definitely times when all you want to do is put on an episode of Law and Order because you know in 42 minutes someone's going to get arrested, someone's going to go to prison, and as P.D. James said, order is restored, chaos is put back in its Pandora's box. And it's so comforting. You can go to bed, you can have your windows open. But then there are other times you're feeling a bit more like, oh, I hate the world sucks. And so you put on No Country for Old Men and it reinforces this view that all of humanity is lost.
I didn't get that feeling.
There is this different, there's a different appetite for things. But I think definitely the way that we kind of talk about crime and portray crime in pop culture does reflect that sort of moral universe. We want to try and understand the world we live in, and of course storytelling, being the oldest human tradition, is a way for us to understand who we are, including at times of uncertainty. I mean, it's not crime fiction, but I remember when Contagion became the biggest movie of the first few weeks of the pandemic, and you would think, why would you want to watch something about a global pandemic right now? Kate Winslet and everyone dies, spoiler alert. But there is this whole relationship we have as the audience that, the person you actually follow through that story is Matt Damon, and he survives to the end. He's the survivor, therefore we're going to survive this pandemic. And I think a lot of that happens in crime fiction as well. You put yourself in the space of the detective or, the victim that triumphs. And so it makes you feel better about where you are in the world because you also get to be the survivor. And also we do love puzzles. Yeah. We love to solve something.
But it's also interesting that there's a new genre at the moment of, frauds, like the Tinder swindler. And
Inventing Anna.
Inventing Anna,
Yeah.
which I didn't think was great.
It's terrible.
It's terrible.
Sorry.
You can say that.
It's terrible.
Yes, but fraud was something that was never really on the radar. It's not very bloody or gory.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that that's a genre that's very much at the moment.
But those stories are also in sort of, air quote, glamorous industries. Inventing Anna is about a con woman who kind of took down New York's elite and got a lot of money out of them. So there's a bit of schadenfreude in that as well. And same with the Tinder swindler. It's dating, it's apps, or all the different miniseries we've had recently about, tech billionaires like The Dropout and We Crashed. You just want to see these are people that are, and industries that are held up. And we love schadenfreude. We love to see them brought down.
Yes, and the same with yet the dropout and the fact that all those very wealthy people had invested and hadn't done their due diligence.
Exactly. And I feel a bit better about not having had $5 billion to be swindled out of.
But the interest in fraud is not new, though. I mean, Thomas Mann wrote that fabulous book, Confessions of Felix Krull, and that was at a time, a classic situation where huge inequality, and this guy makes it up from the poorest of the poor environment to the very top of social life in Europe. And it's this idea, like Melissa, can I talk about Melissa
Caddick. Yeah.
Caddick, sorry. I mean, it's just, you look at that situation, you just gobsmacked. Did she really think she was going to get away with that?
Yeah, well, she did.
So we sit...
Up to a point.
Up to a point.
So we find ourselves sitting at this very interesting point. A couple of weeks after the verdict in the Chris Dawson trial, Teacher's Pet downloaded 60 million times, 3 times the population of Australia have downloaded that podcast. Liar, Liar, the podcast that Kate was involved in about the Melissa Caddick case. Newspaper full of the story of Adnan Syed's conviction being vacated. The person, one of the people at the heart of Serial, the podcast that was one of the first a podcast that made this huge true crime podcast that made this huge impact. Wenlei, we're in a very interesting point in terms of the proliferation of these stories, their popularity, the number of them that are being produced. What is driving this?
A lot of it is audience interest. I'm not going to diminish that. But a part of that story, a huge part of the story, is actually all of this coincides with a massive explosion in streaming services. Now, if news media is business, entertainment media is even bigger business, and we're talking about a lot of money at play. So every single company in the world who produces any form of entertainment, whether it be podcasts, books, television or film, looks at a success story like Making a Murderer, and they go, where is my next Making a Murderer? Actually, where is my next 7 Making a Murderers? Because if Netflix has it, then Hulu has to have it, Foxtel has to have it, HBO has to have it, and they've got to have it right now. And so you've got all these TV and film executives doing it, and so therefore you end up being inundated. It's an onslaught, an assault really, of all of this programming. And so you go, well, this is what everyone else is watching because there's so much of it, I have to be in on it too. It becomes this circular economy. But at the same time, you kind of have to wonder, is this the trend that's going to keep on forever, or is it just because it's driven by a lot of people around boardrooms thinking, if I'm not on this trend, then we're going to fail, we're going to lose subscribers. Because I think what's interesting is that the one sort of medium that in entertainment that is sort of contracting a little bit is cinema. And what you don't get is a lot of crime movies in the cinema. In many ways, streaming's taken over that space. They've come in and gone, actually, think about something like Knives Out, which was hugely successful. It's not true crime, but it's my favourite kind of crime.
Totally not true crime.
Totally not true crime. I mean, did I believe Daniel Craig's accent? No, but I loved it. But Netflix came along and said, that was a massive cinema success. We're going to pay Rian Johnson $200 million to make sure we have that on our platform. So it ends up being driven a lot by commercial decisions, and it is this echo chamber of people who keep looking at what their competitors are doing. So if Wondery has a podcast on Dr. Death, then that's going to get bought out by someone else, and then someone's going to go, where's my version of that?
That's the best explanation I have ever heard of that.
Well,
fantastic.
And I want you to tell us, you mentioned a showrunner giving a name to that syndrome.
Yeah, I was talking, sorry, name dropping, to Andy Ciara. He's a showrunner.
Who's he?
He's an up-and-comer showrunner, so he's not like, Steven Spielberg. But he wrote a movie a few years ago called Palm Springs. It's a rom-com, it's hilarious, you should watch it. But he has a new series out called The Resort. It starts off as a bit of a crime fiction story, but it actually turns into this big sci-fi thing about, the existence of life. But he called it the true crime industrial complex. And once something is an industrial complex, then you know that it's all about money.
Well,
right on.
I feel like there's a lot to discuss in there, and in particular, I want to make sure that we really think about what all of this means to us living in an environment, a cultural environment saturated with crime. But I want to allow those of you, if you've got some questions, there's a couple of microphones here. a couple of, short, sharp, incisive questions about things we haven't thought about would be wonderful. So do come and join the conversation. With that, just going back quickly to one look at that question about the true crime industrial complex, does that mean the kind of the cycle that you've described, a circular economy, not in a good way, is it something that as soon as there are two giant failures, it might stop? Or do you feel that it's got something that's got some kind of enduring interest there?
I mean, there's always going to be an appetite for good stories told well. I do wonder whether or not we will continue to get a bunch of mediocre stories told kind of okay, because what we'll see soon enough, and I'm sure that will be to the relief to many people in the room, is that there will have to be consolidation of streaming services. We can't keep paying for 17 different streaming services. And once that sort of business thing happens, then they're going to get a lot tighter with money. There are fewer competitors, and they're going to go, actually, we only need to greenlight the 4 best shows and not the 17 okay shows.
Yeah. So we've got a question, one on each microphone, I think. So, yeah, go ahead, over here. Sorry.
I didn't quite catch it. Could you speak
I'll
into the microphone?
I'll repeat the question. I mean, so it's a question about whether that drop that we've seen in actual crime is linked to the rise in portrayals of crime and stories about crime.
Look, I'd be guessing, but I'd guess no. Okay. Look, there's any number of factors that could influence people's attitudes towards crime, but if you wanted to point to factors that have been shown to be strongly related with assault, it's the drop in alcohol consumption. That's been sufficient to offset the rise you might have otherwise expected from methamphetamine use. But I'm not suggesting for a moment that I know all the factors that were involved. Thanks for the question.
And can I just answer that as well? Just from some of the criminals that I've watched over a while, the actual economic cost of doing a heroin importation is a lot. Getting the boat, getting the captain, getting the goods. And quite a few of them turn to economic crimes, to mortgage frauds, identity theft, cybercrime, because the outlays are so much smaller and the results can be just as big. So there's a certain economic drive as well. And it's interesting that, one of the major crimes in Africa and Southeast Asia is counterfeiting pharmaceuticals. And almost half the pharmaceuticals in that region are fake. So there's always the manoeuvring into new areas, and ransomware is a really big thing at the moment.
No.
Thank you.
I'm a bit shorter, so it's a bit easier to project into this. My question's around, I guess, just thinking about the Australian context and thinking about the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in incarceration. But I don't see that saturation of those stories in our crime, in our sort of cultural discussion, whether it's in podcasts. And I know there are a few, but I'm just thinking about the popularity of The Teacher's Pet and what got us into that story and what was so captivating, why we're not seeing that, and what that, I guess, says about us. I'm just wondering.
I'm sure Kate's got the long answer, but I'll tell you I have tried numerous times to get stories up and running about Aboriginal imprisonment, and the media I encounter, just not interested. Unless someone dies in jail or there's been a shooting, such as occurred up in the Northern Territory. But
even then, it's split, right? It splits the cultural discussion.
Yeah.
About it's not we're all on, we're all against Chris Dawson. We all know it's sort of a unifying thing. But I find when it's an Aboriginal story, we have the two sides of.
Well, it was like when that I think the 3-year-old child Cleo Smith went missing in Western Australia. It was a huge media story, and at that time there was a number of Aboriginal people who said this is so upsetting because a child went missing and was found tortured and dead, kidnapped by a relative, and the lack of police interest, the lack of media interest could have saved that child. And I just think it's, white, like Stephanie Scott, the school teacher that was murdered, just before her wedding. It's those kind of stories that the media gravitates to, not shocking stories, equally horrifying stories that happen in Aboriginal communities, and we just don't do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of a wider piece about media representation in general, and that's across all crimes and not just, child kidnappings, and also just the stories that we tell about ourselves as well, and that includes in fiction. So if you think of some of the most popular crime shows of the past 10 years, True Detective, the rest of it, all those victims tend to be white. I think of a movie like Wind River, which was about a Native American woman who had gone missing on a reservation, but the entire focus of the film was the experiences of the two white detectives, because that is what people who make the decisions think is what audiences will turn up for, or what audiences will read or click.
Yeah.
One podcast that did it really well was Bowraville, about the disappearance of the 3 Aboriginal people. I think they were actually murdered. I think they found one of the bodies, but that was done really well by Dan Box from The Australian.
I think we've probably just got time for one more short question, and just because you've been waiting there for the longest, so apologies to other audience members, but a quick question from you.
Hi, thank you all for being here today. I think I remember seeing something on the blurb talking about the blurb about this segment, talking about the paradox between the fact that prison is quite ineffective on crime, but the fact that it's a widely used tool. We didn't mention that at all, so I was just curious. It had piqued my interest, and I was curious if you guys had anything to say about it.
So does incarceration work? Don, putting you on the spot there.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Look, the balance of evidence suggests that you do get a reduction in crime from an increase in imprisonment, but the effect is weak. So, for example, the US studies indicate, and one we did in Australia, indicate that a 10% increase in the imprisonment rate generates somewhere between 0.5% and a 1% drop in general crime. It's probably the least effective way you could get of reducing crime, which isn't to say that some people, particularly the ones Kate talks about, shouldn't be locked up. But that's justice. That's not about crime control. So,
and also, I think the longer you are in jail, the more likely you are to be a repeat offender when you come out. The recidivism rates are quite high, I think, the longer you're in there, isn't it?
Well, it's partly because people who are likely to reoffend tend to end up in jail.
Yeah.
So it's
Stuck
also
in a loop.
It's also true, though, that the older you get, the less likely you are to repeat offending. So a lot of people are being locked up for far longer than is necessary if your real concern is safety. But is that answering your question?
Partly. Yeah. I think it's a good answer to the question, but I feel like it's a very big piece of discussion that we perhaps don't have time to pursue further, because I really want us to think a little bit about this overall. I want to get a final comment from each of you about the moment where we find ourselves. So that we've talked about, the fact that crime is dropping, and, I don't know, let's see it go as low as it possibly can. But we live in this cultural moment where we are obsessively reading about these stories. And I just, there are some effects that we can all see around us. Wenlei and I were talking about some of those things that we all do, women, when you're walking around at night. You've got your car keys in your hand in a particular way. You'd probably be useless in a crisis if something actually happened. But all of this the sense that we live with about, do we feel like crime is all around us? What is the effect of this? What does it mean about how we think about crime, about people who are defined as criminals? And so I really just want to get a comment of you from each of you about what does this picture mean?
Yeah.
A small question.
Which of us do you want to answer the question?
I'd like a comment from all of
Wenlei,
you.
you can go first.
Oh, okay.
Well,
what does it all mean?
You want to go first?
What does it all mean? I mean, I guess it like any form of storytelling, fiction or non-fiction, in the way that we try and make sense of everything. I mean, do I still lock my windows at night sometimes? Yeah, probably. And I do use my keys. And, and I watched Mr. Robot and I went, oh God, I need to tape up my web camera because that seems really easily hackable. So it does become sort of this idea that it can be instructional in a way. I don't know how actually effective it is, but every time I do watch something to do with crime or read something to do with crime, I just go, yep, got to do that. So on a very practical level, not philosophical.
Don.
Look, I think we are missing a golden opportunity to take the foot off the prison accelerator and start thinking a bit more constructively about crime. And it's a tragedy that so many people still think it's prevalent.
And I feel shocking that I think, well, thank God, there are still criminals to write about. I'm completely self-interest here. So, not the really bad ones.
So we've elucidated a terrible conflict of interest at the heart of our discussion.
Exactly.
Those of us who are here as ordinary citizens, we're happy about the crime drop. Kate is unhappy. Wenlei is going to observe and keep us posted with what's going on in the world of fictional crime. Thank you so much to all of you for being part of this discussion. It's been wonderful to have it. I do feel like there's a whole lot of other directions that we could go in, so maybe that's for a future date.
The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit the Ethics Centre website to find out more. Thank you.